Evening. I'm Father Alexander. This is St. Peter's in Hove. Welcome to our 212th step in our walking tour through the Bible. And we're on Ecclesiastes chapter 3. Now, this is a very, very famous passage. The first bit is anyway. Then there's a series of aphorisms which follow. There is a season for everything, a time for every occupation under heaven, says the writer. A time for giving birth, a time for dying, a time for planting, a time for uprooting what has been planted, a time for killing, a time for healing, a time for knocking down, a time for building, a time for tears, a time for laughter, a time for mourning, a time for dancing, a time for throwing stones away, a time for gathering them, a time for embracing, a time to refrain from embracing, a time for searching, a time for losing, a time for keeping, a time for discarding, a time for tearing, a time for sowing, a time for keeping silent, a time for speaking, a time for loving, a time for hating, a time for war, a time for peace. It's an extraordinary passage. It's a very beautiful passage. It's even more beautiful, actually, in the Old English translation, that is, say, the King James Bible or the Dowie Bible. It sounds much better. What does it mean? It's one of the passages that's sometimes read at funerals. And it's a good one for funerals because the preacher can preach about how a time for mourning, a time for dancing, a time for tears, a time for laughter. A funeral is a time for tears and a time for mourning, but there will come laughter, there will come dancing in due course. In other words, life is cyclical, and what we're feeling right now, we won't always be feeling. Our present grief at the funeral is a necessary stage on our journey, our emotional journey to healing and to acceptance and back to happiness. It can be useful to preach on those things. In fact, I think it's very useful to preach on those things. It's very important to stress that what you feel now is not to be disregarded, but is rather to be accepted. And by accepting it, we then are enabled eventually to move on. But that moving on process will take time and is not to be hurried. So what is he saying here? He's saying life is cyclical. And that is true. Life is cyclical. It goes up and it goes down and so on, swings and roundabouts. It's a big dipper and so on. You've heard that put in a rather banal way, whereas this is a much more poetic way of putting it. At the same time, what he's saying here is something that is profoundly untrue. And that is, he says, all that he does is act for its time, verse 11. In other words, the human being does stuff that is apt for the time. The circumstances dictate what you do and whether what you do is right or wrong. So there's a time for loving when it's appropriate to love. There's a time for hating when it's appropriate to hate. There's a time for peace when it's appropriate to make peace. There's a time for war when it's appropriate to make war. But nothing's good nor bad, but thinking makes it so. Nothing's good nor bad, but the circumstances dictate what is right. This is profoundly wrong. And it leads me to think that, at least in this chapter, the religious beliefs of the writer are more or less tenuous in the extreme. He's saying a time for knocking down, a time for building up, a time for throwing away sticks, a time for picking up sticks. It really only depends on the time. Whereas we know, as believers, but also just as human beings, there are certain things that are always wrong. And there are certain things that are always right. But that idea that some things are just wrong and always wrong, no matter what the circumstances, that is a profoundly held Catholic belief. It's a profoundly held Christian belief. It's a profoundly held human belief. So he says, oh, there's a time for, he does actually say a time for killing, a time for healing. Actually, when is this time for killing? Please explain to me when it's right to kill people. Oh, I'm sorry, we've decided to put you to death because, the time is right for that. I don't think so. I'm not to be put to death, whatever the time may be. I have an inalienable right to life. None of you can say, oh, well, the circumstances being what they are, and it's an unusual coming together of circumstances, dictate that we must put you to death. Rubbish. Those circumstances can never be, because putting me to death would be a morally, intrinsically evil act. And there's no time that allows that. Again, we do get this idea, don't we? We've got this lazy way of thinking. Oh, yes, it's a lazy way of thinking, where you say, oh, well, you've got to understand that the times were different and people acted in a way which we would not approve of now, but we can't blame them for acting that way. So let's say it was okay, really, or it was understandable, which is another way of saying okay, that Henry VIII had Anne Boleyn executed after on trumped up charges. He had her judicially murdered, but that's okay, because you see, in those days it was different. You know, the anger of the king is death, and she knew that she was playing a high stakes game, and so on and so forth. No, actually, it's wrong. It's wrong then. It's wrong now. It cannot be allowed. Again, we can't make excuses for Stalin or for Mao. Killing on a great scale, or even on a very small scale, is simply wrong when it's done for a matter of political expediency or personal convenience. It's simply wrong. Things were different in those days. Oh, yes, they were different in those days, but more importantly, they were different in Tudor times, but more importantly, they were the same, because human beings were still human beings even in Tudor times. The rule of law was still the rule of law in Tudor times. Incidentally, the people who condemned Anne Boleyn to death, they knew that they were doing wrong. And it was obvious to everybody. Nobody said so, but everybody knew in their conscience that this was wrong. That is why somebody like Thomas More is a massive hero, because he stood up and pointed out what was wrong when everybody else buried their head in the sand. So the time doesn't change the nature of morality. Morality depends on the eternal verities, that an eternal means outside time. They don't change, they don't fluctuate. And all this nonsense about the church must keep up with the times, if that means the church must therefore sanction things like death penalty or murder or something like that, no, that's not going to happen at all, or adultery and things like that. No, it cannot happen. We have been given, we have an insight into morality, and we see that which is moral is unchanging. One of the people who said this, of course, was Immanuel Kant, who was no Catholic. I suppose Immanuel Kant was, in fact, a Lutheran. He lived in Prussia, so he was a Lutheran. In fact, almost certainly he was an unbeliever. He didn't actually believe in God, but he did believe in morality. That which is exceptionless is that which binds us. The nature of the moral obligation is its exceptional, its exception-free nature, and the fact that it's good for all circumstances and for all times. If it's not good for all circumstances and all times, then it's not a law to be followed. Right. Having established that, as I hope I do, I think the author, although he said something very beautiful here, a time for dying, a time for being born, and so on and so forth, nevertheless, we as human beings are called to live a morality that transcends time and transcends circumstances. That is important. Now, he then goes on to say in his aphorism something else. But although he, God, has given us an awareness of the passage of time, we can grasp neither the beginning nor the end of what God does. Dead, he's wrong. Now, again, what is he saying here? What I think he's saying is this: we understand moments of time. Here I am. I know where I am. I understand what I'm doing. I understand what time it is. It's 1830, by the way, and I think I know what the date is. I think it's the 24th of October, 2022. This is this particular moment. However, I am the sort of person, by nature of the fact that I'm a human being, I understand also the idea of duration. I don't just live isolated moments. The moments I live are joined up. I have a sense of the present. I have a sense of the past. I have a sense of the future. I have had a sense of time since the 10th of August, 1963, all those years ago. When I first came into this world and I first started to live in the world, free from my mother's womb, and I started to live in time. I understand time and I see time as a unity, because what happened to me in 1973, what happened to me in 1983, what happened to me in 1993, 2003, and so on, these are all joined up by my consciousness. I am conscious of moments, such as this one, but I intuit the whole, the passage of time. Dame Iris Murdoch said, and she was right, we experience parts, but we intuit wholes. This can mean something as simple as I eat an orange and I have an experience of that particular orange. But in eating one orange, I do understand something about all the oranges on earth and what an orange is. Again, I live this moment and I understand something of my own personal history. The idea that we can understand history, personal history, but group history, corporate history, is a gift from God. And this is something he doesn't seem to grasp. He says, although he's given us an awareness of the passage of time, we can grasp neither the beginning or the end. Yes, we can grasp the beginning and the end. I know where I came from. I know where I'm going. Incidentally, because I know what time is, that's why I make sacrifices for the future. That's why I, or our generation, will do things which are not necessarily good for us, but good for future generations. That is why we, the present generation, honor the past and learn from the past and protect, shall we say, the memory of the past. This is very, very important. We're not just here on our own. We're part of a community that stretches back in time and stretches forward in time, and of course, stretches across the entire globe. We are bound to other people through space and through time. And of course, space and time are something else that Immanuel Kant talked about. They seem to be things we're born with, according to Kant, ideas that we have inside us and through which we process all the things that happen to us, all the things that we experience. Our experience forms a whole. Okay, the desire and the pursuit of the whole, that is what our life is about. And our desire and pursuit of the whole is not fruitless. We can pursue the whole. So this guy is wrong. There's a time for giving birth and a time for dying. Actually, what I'd say about that is how wrong you are. You give birth on one year, you die on the next year. No, you're constantly giving birth. You're constantly dying. I'm constantly aware of bringing new things to birth. I'm constantly aware of leaving old things behind. Birth and death interpenetrate in human existence. I've gone on far too long, but you see what a profound passage this is. Profoundly wrong, but still profound. All the best then. Bye.